Welcome to Conversations. It's my pleasure today to introduce you out there in the audience to Mr. Harry Fritz, who is chairman of the History Department at the University of Montana, and who is pushing a new book
That's why I'm here.
called Montana, Land of Contrast. And the land of contrast is important. It's down there in little letters, but I read the book, and it is very much about the contrast in Montana. Harry, if I may call you that.
All right.
As I say, I read the book. I was very impressed. I'm very grateful for the experience. Why is it that you thought we needed a new book on Montana, and what did you plan to accomplish by writing it?
Well, history happens, and it needs to be the writing of history. You need to bring things up to date. And I think one of the virtues of this book is that it covers the decade of the 1990s and into the 21st century. And it's a nice short narrative. You don't have to plow through a 400-page textbook in order to learn something about Montana history.
It's one thing I liked about it.
Yeah, it's a brief and readable, and it brings the story up to date. The only other Montana history book that's available on the market now is a 400-page book, which was published 10 years ago. And a lot of things have happened in Montana in the last decade, a lot of fundamental developments. And that book is, while it's an excellent book for what happened before 1991, it's a little dated. And this book will be a little dated in 10 years, I'm sure. But its virtue now is that it brings developments right up to the present. It covers the elections of 2000, the results of the census of 2000, and probably the most important issue of public policy that we face in Montana now, the question of electrical energy deregulation, all covered in the book.
We'll get to that, of course. Let's go back to Lewis and Clark, just sort of start at the beginning and move forward a bit. Lewis and Clark seem pretty straightforward, and I think most of us have some sense of what that is. I wasn't aware that Jefferson thought that we could find the Northwest Passage by going up the river.
He tried, his instructions to Jefferson were to determine the easiest route from the Missouri to the Columbia by means of water communication. Water communication. Now, he probably envisioned a little portage in there, but the full expectation was that it would be easy to transfer your baggage, your boat, your equipment from one stream to another.
So no one was aware that the Rocky Mountains were there?
Nobody had ever seen them. No American had ever seen them. Some Canadians had seen them a couple hundred miles to the north. But what the Canadians had to say about the Montana Rockies was mainly guesswork, because nobody had been down here to see it. Lewis and Clark were the first known Europeans to see the Rocky Mountains at these latitudes.
Something that kind of got a bit vague for me until I stopped and reread and looked at it was the importance of salmon for this whole thing.
Well, certainly on the Columbia River, Lewis and Clark got into a salmon culture on the Columbia and Snake rivers, and they were astounded at the salmon runs that were still in effect when they hit the river in the fall of 1805. And then all of the Native Americans that they saw on both sides of the Snake and the Columbia River all the way to the ocean were doing nothing but catching and drying fish. And they used it as trade, they used it as food stuff. It's too bad they didn't like fish, or maybe they'd have had a better time.
They didn't like fish?
They didn't like fish.
I guess what I was referring to is the fact that there were salmon on one side of the Rockies and there weren't on the other.
One of the key
sort of proved.
One of the key questions you can ask about the Lewis and Clark expedition is why, when they got on the Bitterroot River, they just didn't stay on that river, because it is part of the Columbia River system, and eventually you can get to the Pacific Ocean by just floating down the Bitterroot, the Clark Fork, the Pend Oreille, and the Columbia Rivers. But Lewis said in the journals that there's no salmon in the river here. There are no salmon in the Bitterroot River. And he figured that if the salmon can't get upriver, we might have a little trouble getting downriver. There must be some obstacle that prevents the salmon from getting this far. And if that obstacle is enough to keep fish from coming up, it might be enough to keep us from going down. And he was referring, I think, to, and there was an obstacle. He didn't know that, but there was an obstacle, Kettle Falls on the Columbia River, which is now inundated behind Grand Coulee Dam, but was a pretty sizable falls before that.
Something that wasn't clear to me is the significance of the Great Falls. That proved something, and now I can't remember what it was that it proved, and at the time I couldn't quite figure out why that proved it. But
The most amazing thing about the Great Falls of the Missouri is that Lewis and Clark knew they were there before they got here. They'd gotten information from Native Americans about the Missouri River and the major tributaries and about the falls, and they had it printed on a map at a pretty precise location. I think the significance of the falls is that there were more falls than they thought. There's supposed to be one falls. There are 5 falls. To portage around them, it was an 18-and-a-half-mile trek, and the whole process took up a whole month out of the traveling season. They expected to be there a day or two. But even more important than that, I think they expected to encounter the Shoshone Indians at Great Falls. And they knew the Shoshone were the last Plains tribe that they would encounter. And they needed some directions, they needed some help transporting their baggage and equipment. They needed to buy some horses because they knew they were going to have to leave the river and cross the mountains. And no Shoshone at the Great Falls,
Right.
Big disappointment.
that was a surprise you pointed out to me, or not you in the book pointed out to me. They never saw an Indian in Montana until they got to the mountains.
Absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. You're coming in on the Missouri River, and you're coming through territory that was inhabited by the Hidatsa or the Gros Ventre Indians, the Assiniboine, the Atsina, the Blackfeet, the Crow, traveling tribes, and you come all the way up the Missouri River, all the way up the Jefferson and Beaverhead rivers, and you're only about 30 miles from Idaho, down around Bannock area, really, before you see a single Indian.
And they saw
One
single Indian.
single Indian is the only Indian they saw in Montana on the whole trip to that point, which is it's absolutely amazing.
And then
You certainly couldn't do that today.
And then the coincidences of Sacagawea's real brother.
They were looking for the Shoshone. They expected to find the Shoshone at the Great Falls, or certainly at the Three Forks. No Shoshone. When they finally found the Shoshone, they weren't even in America. They were across the Continental Divide in Idaho. And I think they'd been driven out there by the Blackfeet Indians who had acquired guns. Blackfeet are the first Plains tribe to acquire weapons. And then they brought them back into Montana to the headwaters of the Beaverhead River, and that's where Sacagawea, who was a Shoshone, and that's why she's along, recognized the chief, Kameawait, as her brother.
A question just occurs to me that isn't even in the book. The boy was named or nicknamed Pomp.
Clark nicknamed him Pomp.
Now I grew up around Billings, and we had Pompey's Pillar, and I always thought that was told that was named after him.
Pomp.
So why didn't they call it Pomp's Pillar?
Well,
Or is that any?
Clark called it Pompey's Tower. Pompey's Tower. But the first editor of the Lewis and Clark journals in 1814, Nicholas Biddle, wrote it in as Pompey's Pillar.
Biddle did the?
And that's what it's been ever since.
We don't want to get carried away, but
No,
Biddle-
but I think they should change the name back to Pompey's Tower.
And Biddle was wound up with Lincoln. Was an assistant, wasn't he, or something? Because Biddle was.
Nicholas Biddle's main career, I think why he's known to history, is that he was president of the Second Bank of the United States in the 1820s and 1830s.
Okay, I thought I knew that name from somewhere
He's
in
the
there.
big enemy of Andrew Jackson.
Oh,
It's
all right.
Jackson versus Biddle when you want to personalize history on the bank war.
Let's move on to the Indians, Native Americans, whatever. It's a really interesting chapter. It debunks a lot of myths that I think even a lot of Native Americans believe. Maybe I should just go ahead and see which ones you think you debunked, but
Well, I think in the late 19th century, the period of Indian removal, when Indians were established on the current reservation system, is a pretty well-known portion of Montana history. That is, an awful lot of books have been written about Native Americans in the 19th century, and especially about their military encounters with whites. So if there's one topic in the history of Montana that's probably been more thoroughly covered than any other topic in American history, it's the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand. 800 books about that battle. There are not 800 books written about any other battle in American history. And the Nez Perce retreat, Chief Joseph's retreat through Montana the year later in 1877, is not far behind. And that's attracted all the attention. One of the problems, I think, with Native American history is that for the 20th century, it hasn't been written yet. We just don't have a literature out there on Native Americans in the West in the 20th century.
I want to get there, but I want to go back a little
All
bit
right.
before we get there. What I was specifically talking about is that we think of, and I think even the media and even many Indians themselves think of a culture that goes back to the dim past, and the picture of the Indian on horseback with a rifle in his hand that Charlie Russell popularized. Not true, or true, but...
Well, there have been Indians in Montana for 10 or 11,000 years, but not the same Indians.
Right.
And in terms of anthropology, Montana, the Indians that were in Montana when Lewis and Clark arrived had only been here for 150 years at the longest. So it's a real dynamic Indian population. It's a mobile Indian population that's moving from place to place. The Blackfeet, for example, are a Canadian Indian tribe from north and a little west of the Great Lakes a couple hundred years before Lewis and Clark. And they moved west and moved a little south into Montana and into Canada, where they are today. The Crow are an eastern tribe. Cheyenne are an eastern tribe.
And the reason for that was that...
Well, most people claim it's white European population pressure in the east that pushed these Native American tribes west, and others say, no, there's a pull factor too. Montana was a place to be, an excellent country, and so they came here because they wanted to, not because they were pushed here. But for whatever cause, it's a dynamic tribal demography that Lewis and Clark kind of catch at a snapshot, a freeze frame when they arrive.
So a culture was destroyed, but it wasn't a culture that went back to the dim...
Well, it's our image of a Native American is Charlie Russell's image. Mounted warrior, armed warrior.
And the horse?
And the horse doesn't arrive in Montana until about 1750. And weapons later than that. The Shoshone didn't have weapons at all. They had a lot of horses, but they didn't have any weapons when Lewis and Clark came through. So the mounted, armed Indian is 50 years old at most when Lewis and Clark arrived.
Where was I going to go with this? Okay. The Custer battle and all of that, I think many of us think of it that as out on the edges of civilization. It was, what, 1876?
1876.
My grandfather was 6 and remembered when the news came through. What was happening in 1876? There were towns, right?
Well, not much in that part of Montana.
No, but I mean...
gold was discovered in Montana in 1862, and the first permanent white settlements of any size. There were a couple of missions before that, a couple of trading posts. But the first permanent white settlements of any size at Bannock and Virginia City and Helena all date from the era of the gold rush. And that's mostly a western Montana phenomenon. Eastern Montana in 1877 was just, well, that's the year of the hard winter. So we're just looking at the end of the open range cattle kingdom. Or excuse me, that's 10 years before the hard winter.
Oh, okay.
So it is still buffalo country. still Indian country, not surveyed, not settled at all.
So you've sort of touched on my point, is that this is a very discrete chapter. It is the chapter that deals with the Indians, and that's about it in the whole book. And you're saying that the reason for that is that the material hasn't been written, or?
If you look at the literature on Montana Native Americans, there are some tremendous studies, some tremendous books about the Flatheads, about the Crow in the 19th century. And then you want to find out what happened to these Indians in the 20th century. Pretty slim pickings. The literature hasn't been there. We know a little bit about the Crows up to 1933, 1/3 of the century. We have a few articles about allotment of the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in 1911.
So you mean even the government relationships with the government, the pickings are pretty slim as far as?
Pretty slim. I mean, the records are out there. We can go out and find the tribal records for the establishment of tribal governments in 1934 and after. And we know a lot about some of the Indian issues, termination issues, gambling issue today, for example. But for some reason, historians haven't really picked up on the subject and written the kind of book covering all of the Montana Indian tribes in the 20th century, reservation life, essentially, that I think needs to be done. It's one of the greatest voids, a gaping void in the historical literature of Montana.
When I grew up in Montana, and part of that is maybe not for historians, but that we didn't know, we didn't want to know, and they were sort of all around us, but it was a different, the cliches and the stereotypes were there.
Well, I think some of that is true. I think in the recent period, however, we've become more aware of the Indian presence and Indian contributions and Indian issues in Montana, and the Indians have made us aware of those issues in terms of voting, in terms of districting, in terms of gambling. These are native, in terms of education, these are Native American issues. So I think that when the history of Montana Indian people in the 20th century is written, it'll probably be written by Native American historians.
You said that the Custer battle, you give a very good account of the battle.
Bullet by bullet and arrow by arrow.
Well, not quite. But then having done that, you say that it really was rather insignificant.
The interesting notion about the Custer battle is that militarily it is totally insignificant. We usually think that a major battle is a turning point in history. Battles change things. But the Custer battle didn't change any of the vast historical processes that were going on, the slaughter of the buffalo herds, the putting Native Americans on reservations, the opening up of the West to cattle and later to settlers. All of these things continued as if the battle had never occurred, and yet there's something about that battle that has attracted the attention of the writers of 800 books, not to mention the painters and the poets and the artists and the TV dramatists that have made their living on Custer's last stand.
As I say, my grandfather, 6 years old, remembers. I mean, it electrified the country in some way. Was that used as a justification for the effort to eliminate the Indians?
I think that
look what they did to Custer.
They didn't need the Custer battle.
Oh, okay.
They already had the justifications in place. And what was happening at the time of the Custer battle was the decimation of the great buffalo herds on the Great Plains. And it was never really official government policy to kill off the buffalo. Although everybody in government knew, and you get a lot of statements from government people to this effect, that when the buffalo are gone, the Indian will be defenseless. And then the only solution to the Indian problem will be to put them on reservations. So the government was kind of egging on the slaughter of the buffalo, but it was not done as a government policy. It was done as a capitalistic enterprise. Private enterprise did in the buffalo because their skins were valuable.
Which is what I want to ask you about Canada. All of this seems, looking backward, to have a kind of inevitability, but Canada had a different policy. At least I'm aware of there were times in Canada where the Mounties were sent out to protect the Indians against the settlers. I mean, the government at least didn't seem quite as rapacious and...
I think, and I don't know that much about Canadian Indian policy, just enough to make some breezy generalizations. But I think that's true. I mean, not that the United States Army didn't protect the Indian against settlers from time to time as well in our history, but the Canadians did a better job of keeping the Indian community together from the beginning. And so the Canadian Indian reservations, the Canadian Indian peoples today, are much more of a people, much more of a united community than they are here in Montana. Their lands have been intact, kept intact. Their language, they still know their language. Nobody speaks Blackfeet anymore. There's a few speakers. But we have to learn it from the Canadian Blackfeet who have retained that language.
Another kind of stereotype, especially against among the anti-religious, is that religion helped do the Indians in. But you point out that the Indians asked for the Catholic missionaries to come. They'd heard about them and they wanted them there.
Native Americans used what parts of Catholicism and Protestantism that they could fit into their worldviews, their pre-existing religious views. And in that sense, they're like, I think, most religions in the world that are kind of, they call them syncretic. They're able to pick up bits and pieces from other philosophic views, other worldviews, and fit them into their lifestyle and their outlook. And that's the way Native Americans, I think, utilized the missionaries, both Protestant and Catholic, mainly Catholic in the early period, here in Montana. As long as the Catholic missionaries could deliver the goods, protection from the enemies, some education and some food, they were welcome. But once that ran out, they were no longer welcome.
One last question about this, and a larger question area is, and you probably could spend the rest of the time talking, what is it in the American character or the government of that century that caused this massive greed and destruction of the native population and the rape of the land? I mean, it just seemed...
Well, I think there certainly are racial concerns. 19th century is a century where the state of science led us to believe in the inherited inferiority of certain varieties of human beings. It's scientific racism. You can't blame people for being racist. That's what they were told when they were educated. But I've always thought that one of the great differences between Europeans and Indians is over the nature of land use. Whites wanted to survey out land and put settlers on it in 40-acre or 80-acre or 160-acre plots. And when you utilize that land that way, the Jeffersonian way, a small amount of land can support a large number of people. But the Native Americans used land as a hunting economy. They were all sedentary agriculturists, but they were also hunters and wanderers. And under that system of land use, it took a tremendous amount of land to support a very small number of people. So Europeans come over and say, hey, they're wasting the land. They're wasting the land. We can put the land to much better use and support many, many times as many people on this land. You're wasting it. So we'll take it.
As it turns out, as we get on a little bit further, the Indians were right, at least about the eastern part of the state. We move on, to the not the pioneers, the settlers. The copper? Is this where we get into the mining and the copper?
Yeah, I call my term for 19th century Montana, between the discovery of gold and statehood in 1889, is Pioneer Montana.
That's the term I was trying to remember, Pioneer.
Pioneer Montana.
And this happened mainly in the western part of the state.
Mainly in the west, yeah.
And it centers around first gold and silver and movement into copper and other metals.
And in the lumber industry as well.
Okay. This is a time when history is very much a question of individuals, or at least from your book I got that, and you spend a lot of time on individuals, the copper barons. incredible story of political corruption,
Oh, it's unbelievable.
if nothing else. And one thing I wasn't aware of was that the rest of the country was aware of this, that we were a cause for concern in Washington, and it's, the Montana
We were
was
there.
kind of a standing joke on our corruption.
Some people argue that the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which provided for the direct popular election of senators, is a result of the actions in Montana, where a corrupt legislature, a bribed legislature, chose William A. Clark to be United States Senator. But that kind of thing was going on in a lot of other states as well.
Well, true, and I
Yeah,
mean,
so Montana's not the only.
the Grant administration was not exactly.
It's easy to personalize history, and I think it's an effective way to teach history and to write history, and is to look at it in terms of prominent individuals. It's Dullsville, USA, when you're talking about vast impersonal processes. But history is the combination, I think, of personal action on an impersonal process. And you can argue that the development of mining industry in Montana is inevitable. It's in the cards. It's going to happen. Well, that doesn't make it very interesting or exciting. But when you focus on the mining industry through the personages of Marcus Daly and William A. Clark and F. Augustus Heinze and a whole host of other prominent actors, then I think it comes to life.
That's a great chapter, and it does come to life. Is it Clark who says, when accused of corruption, I never bought a man who wasn't for sale?
Never bought a man who wasn't for sale.
He is quite a character.
Well, folks here from Clark is a national figure, a national figure. Folks from Las Vegas live in Clark County, named after our hero. Folks who go to the University of California at Los Angeles study in the William Andrews Clark Library there. Folks who visit the Guggenheim Museum in New York City will be seeing William Andrews Clark's art collection there. This man had a national impact, and he made his money in Montana, and then he got out.
He wanted to be a senator. He eventually became one, but it took him.
Took him 12 years.
Some of your figures, and I can't remember them, and if I did that kind of show, I'd have notes here with them. The amount of money that was spent on elections per person?
Well, we spend a lot more money on elections now, but we spend it on television advertising mainly.
This was just direct
In those
bribes.
days, they just handed it directly to
Yeah,
the voter.
Maybe it's the time to talk about Republicans and Democrats, and your book is about contrasts. What we do nationally in politics and what we do locally. Could you address some of that?
Montana's got a cyclical political culture, so it's always in the process of changing. Territorial Montana, pioneer Montana, is mainly Democratic. The people are mainly Democratic. They got here by coming up the Missouri River from Democratic areas in Missouri and southern Illinois and Tennessee. Or Marcus Daly imported a lot of Irish miners who were Democratic almost to a man. And so the population is Democratic. When the transcontinental railroads arrive, the Northern Pacific in 1883 and the Great Northern in 1887, they're coming in from the upper Midwest. They're coming in from Chicago and from the Twin Cities, and they start bringing Republican settlers in. And the politics sort of evens out at the time of statehood. In fact, the first elections for the state legislature under statehood, held in late fall of 1889, resulted in a House of Representatives and a state Senate that were evenly divided, Democrats and Republicans, evenly divided. Couldn't accomplish a thing.
Let's talk a bit about the mining. Copper became incredibly big, but it didn't start out with copper.
Started with gold. And we still have gold mines in Montana. There's still gold in them our hills out there. But the gold that was mined in Montana in the 1860s is placer gold. It's surface gold. It's gold that's easy to get to, and individual hard work can get it with sluices and rockers and cradles and flumes and things like that. But that the easy pickings were over within 5 years. First strike is 1862, and the gold rush peaked in 1867. There's still a lot of gold in there, but it's embedded in rock. It's called quartz mining. And in order to get that gold out, you need big, heavy equipment. You need smelters and crushers and stampers and mills and things like that.
This is where the railroads come in.
That's where the railroads and where big money
machinery
comes in. Big.
Yeah.
You and I just can't go out and start up a silver mine or a copper mine.
And it becomes, silver becomes the big mines.
Silver is the main product in the 1870s and 1880s. Montana in the 1880s is the #1 silver producing state in the nation, and there's still a lot of silver out there. But there's no market for silver after 1894. The government used to buy most of the silver, and then it stopped buying it, and the silver economy went kaput overnight.
Which leads us to Marcus Daly and copper, your description of his vision of what could be done with copper. And well, I think summing it up, you say the whole thing came out of the fertile imagination of Marcus Daly. I mean, billions of dollars and international empire and all of this came out of the imagination of one man.
Marcus Daly is one of the most fascinating individuals in the history of Montana, and maybe because we don't know much about him. We don't know much about him personally.
Well, we have one picture. You didn't like pictures taken?
Didn't like pictures taken, so you always see one picture of Marcus Daly, and that's it. A kind of a posed picture when he's an older man. He never wrote any letters. There are no letters that survive from Marcus Daly. Never kept a diary, wrote his memoirs, autobiography, anything like that. We know he's kind of a folk hero. He liked a little rapport with his men, with his miners.
But selling this copper, that's what fascinates me. He decides what? That copper can be profitable?
He decides in 1883, that copper can be produced and sold in huge quantities, tremendous quantities. It's not a precious metal. It's not like gold. It's not like silver. You've got to have tremendous quantities of copper in order to make any money. And there's really no market out there. What are you going to use? What do people need copper for? Well, they make some kitchenware, and they make some cowbells.
Statues.
Yeah, maybe a few statues. I mean, there's not a need for copper when Marcus Daly arrives on the scene. But the telephone industry, the telecommunications industry was just getting going, and they used copper wires. They wired the nation with copper from Montana. And Marcus Daly realized that whether scientifically or intuitively, whether he knew something that nobody else was aware of, he knew there was a market out there, a growing market for copper.
He's out in the middle of almost nowhere, and he needs big money to buy the equipment and stuff. Where does he get it?
That's another thing about Marcus Daly. He had no formal education. We don't know how he really got to know the sources of financial wealth. But when he started his career out in California and Nevada, he got to be close with George Hearst, one of the richest men in America.
The Hearst fortune.
That's right. William Randolph Hearst is his son. He got to know San Francisco financiers. So when he needed money in Montana, he knew where to go to get it. He went to the California financial circle of Hearst and James Hagan and others, and he got the money he needed. And they trusted him, and he was reliable enough that they were willing to invest when he recommended it.
In copper, out in the middle of Montana.
Exactly.
Wow.
And there's no reason to do that. There's no, at first there are no railroads, there's no smelter. The nearest smelter is in Wales. There's no market. Why should we invest millions in a copper mine in Montana? But Marcus Daly won them over, and the rest, as they say, is history.
And then you have to outmaneuver other people in this country who are producing copper. There's a big war over prices, etc.
Big war over prices, and then an attempt to corner the market, and
it gets pretty complicated.
The thing about the War of the Copper Kings, Greg, and this I think is that most previous Montana history books have missed, is that it is absolutely necessary to consolidate all of the individual mine holdings in Butte under a single ownership, because otherwise it's too expensive for a lot of individual miners to go after copper. If you're going to mine copper efficiently and effectively, it's got to be under a single ownership. Otherwise, everybody's tied up in the courts over where your vein ends and mine starts and so forth like this. And so most of the history of Montana, I think, has kind of taken the side of the progressive reformers and the muckrakers and pilloried the centralization and the consolidation and the rise of Anaconda copper. But you got to keep in mind that something like Anaconda copper was absolutely necessary in order to have an effective mining industry in Montana.
And then it becomes international. We wind up in Chile and
Europe, Asia, Latin America. Anaconda copper is founded in Butte, Montana in 1883. And within 40 years, it is the fourth largest corporation in the world. Now that's saying something.
In Montana. Wow. I think we have to move on at some point. Statehood. Thoughts on statehood? It's wound up with all of this, right? All these individuals are not just mining copper. They're after power and...
Yeah, the decade of the 1880s is probably the single most important decade in the history of Montana. Everything happened in that decade. The arrival of the transcontinental railroads, the rise of the open range cattle kingdom, the hard winter, the founding of Anaconda copper, and the decade culminates in statehood, which is a political culmination of the pioneer period.
Gosh, I figure we got about 20 minutes, and this is so
Well, we better get into the 20th century.
I want you to tell the story, though, of the winter of 1887?
86, 87.
This is the one that Charlie Russell does, the starving cow.
Mm-hmm. This is Charlie Russell's career gets started.
Just to lay the groundwork, they bring cattle in. They don't have quite a knowledge of the fluctuations in the state weather, this and that. They've got all these cattle out there on the range, and they think they can feed them on the grass that's there. And what happens that year?
The basis of the open range cattle kingdom is still amazing. There are no fences out there. You just bring your cows up and you put them out in the land. And the thing about the native grasses, the native plains grasses, the bunch grasses and the wheat grasses, is that they cure on the stem. They're more nutritious in the winter than they are in the summer when they're growing. And this is all free land out there, unsurveyed, unsold, unoccupied, and the grass grows out there. So you just put your cow out there and you fatten it up over the winter on free grass. And you can buy them for 5 cents a pound, trek them north from Mexico or Texas or point south, fatten them up over the winter, and sell them in the spring for 30 cents a pound. I mean, it's an absolute way to get rich quick. And a lot of people got rich quick. But they overcrowded the plains, drought hit, the meat market collapsed for other reasons in the east, and then the winter of 1886-87 was one of the hardest winters in the history of Montana. Too many cows out there, not enough food, lots of starvation, tens of thousands of cattle starved to death, froze to death, and a lot of investors lost their shirts in that winter.
For me, I think it was the most moving part of the book, or that passage. Incredible cold, incredible snow. Then you get a Chinook. It melts, and there's a sheet of ice over everything. The cows can't even get through,
right.
And they are cutting themselves on the ice as they're trying to get through it.
They're suffocating, they're freezing, they're bleeding to death. I mean,
freezing, standing up in some cases. Just
one of the ranchers that was driven out of business by the hard winter of 1886-87 was Theodore Roosevelt. He wasn't in Montana. He was just over the border in North Dakota. Visited Montana many times, but he said, "That's it for me."
You point out that in some cases it wasn't the loss of money. These people couldn't stand seeing these things happen to the animals.
That's right.
It was so
And so
horrendous.
what you get after the hard winter is basically the modern Montana farm ranch economy. You go back to fence the homestead and grow enough hay to feed your cows in the wintertime. And that's what we still do in Montana. That's the basis of our ranching industry today. We grow enough hay to feed our cows in the wintertime.
Harry, could we just say that we go as far as we can and maybe you'll come back sometime?
Sure.
Because I don't want to just skip ahead to the present day. It's all too fascinating to me anyway. So we move into, let's go to the eastern part of the state. Now, my grandparents came out here around that time, and they were part of this whole thing. Why do we need farmers out there? How do we get them out there? What happens to them? And the time period is what, around?
It's about 1900 to about 1920.
Okay.
It's the farmer's frontier. It's the homestead frontier in America. It's really the last great farmer's frontier in America. There are a couple of more later on in Canada, but this is really the movement of agriculturalist farmers into central and eastern Montana by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. There's far more people living in eastern Montana in 1915 than there are today. And there are far more towns.
Why did they come?
They came because the land was free. It's the Homestead Act. Now, the Homestead Act had been passed in 1862, but it only gave you 160 acres max. Well, 160 acres might be a good farm some places, but not in Montana. It's too dry out here. But in 1909, Montana Senator Joseph Dixon, a Missoulian, was instrumental in passing what they called the Enlarged Homestead Act, which doubled the amount of land you could acquire simply by moving onto it and living for 3 years. You could get 320 acres simply by moving out to it and living on it for 3 years.
And who moved you out here?
And the railroads move you out here. I mean, they want customers. They want somebody to produce something for them to transport. We've got 3 transcontinental railroads by then: the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Milwaukee Road. We've got promotion campaigns on the part of government at all levels, and we have a tremendous influx of population in Montana between about 1900 and 1918 or so.
My grandparents were part of it, and it worked all right for a while.
Well, it worked when it rained.
When it rained.
And we're in a wet cycle. And it worked when commodity prices were high. And during World War I, 1914, 1918, they were sky high. So it's easy to make money when it rains and when commodity prices is high, when you're growing wheat and barley and other crops like that. And those were the good times, and it looked like they'd go on forever. But then the war ended, the rain stopped. And low commodity prices, poor yields, thousands of Montana farmers lost their land, and thousands more left the state. In the decade of the 1920s, we always think of the 20s as the roaring 20s, the flappers and prosperity, might have been artificial prosperity. It's an agricultural depression in Montana. Montana is the only state in the United States to lose population in the decade of the 1920s.
And it was, in its own way, just as dramatic and as the winter of 76. You talk about grasshoppers eating the salt off of shovels and eating the leather on hinges, and it was... It's
set in
horrendous.
motion. The agriculture depression, which kicked in around 1917, 1918 or so, and lasted really with only one brief little period of prosperity for 20 years. Set in motion trends which I think have continued to the present day. There's an awful lot of counties in eastern Montana that are still losing people, that are still undergoing serious depopulation. There's something like 23 counties in eastern Montana that lost population between 1990 and 2000. at a time when the population of the state as a whole was increasing by over 100,000 people. We have 23 of Montana's 56 counties that are losing people, and most of them all are in the central and eastern portions of the state.
I want to go back and I want to ask you something to clarify something for me that I've never understood. My grandfather, as he was dying, well, you know, before he died, confined to his bed for a long period of time, he would do William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech for me. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor or something this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify labor upon a cross of gold. And he would do that for me down at the shack. There's a picture of William Jennings Bryan up on the wall. And a friend and I go there often, and that's our favorite thing to do to new hostesses or hosts. Who is that guy? Okay. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. What was free silver, and what was that all about?
Well, it's free silver is the big issue in Montana in the 1890s. And what it meant was the government stopped buying the output of Montana silver mines, western silver mines, in 1894, and it just devastated the silver mining industry. And Montana was the #1 silver producing state in the nation. It's an inflationary issue. Free silver means the government should buy the products of Montana mines, of western silver mines, and use that money to coin it into money. They called it free silver. It wasn't exactly free. It was to be coined into money at a ratio of 16-to-1 to gold, so that 1 ounce of gold was 16 times as valuable as an ounce of silver. You're going to peg the price that way.
And the government at one point did buy all of the silver.
It used to, and then it didn't. It started to buy a little more in the 1930s in the New Deal. But this is a big issue. It's an agrarian issue in the rest of America. In Montana, it's a mining issue. This has put miners back to work.
I still don't quite understand it, but we'll let it pass. We get to the chapter on the 30s. And I almost had the feeling that, not that you lost control of it, but that things got so big that it somehow didn't quite all. There's so much going on, and so much from the past that's still working, and so much from the present, and we're hooking up with the federal government, and all of these things are coming together. And right about not the Bonner Dam, the Fort Peck Reservoir and all of that, it really becomes incredibly complicated.
Well, it's one of the things you can say about Montana history right up until the 1930s, let's say, maybe a little earlier, is that it's kind of unique. Things happened here that didn't happen anywhere else in precisely this way. I mean, sure, there's a Western movement that involves more than Montana. There's an era of economic consolidation that involves more than Montana. But, you know, they discovered gold here in 1862, and Custer's last stand happened here in 1876, and the War of the Copper Kings was fought here in the late 19th and early 20th century. Montana history, although it follows general national patterns, is unique. But sometime around I'd say First World War maybe, and certainly with the Great Depression and the New Deal, the sort of center of gravity passes to the nation. And Montana is more of a reactor than an actor. The First World War, the Great Depression, the New Deal, the Second World War, these are something that are happening on the other stage, and they affect us. And we have to respond, we have to react. So we're not really in charge of our destiny to the extent that we may have been earlier. And that's why I think it gets a little more complex. You got a lot more strands to the story.
At what point does the story of this guy named Little and the mines and all of that, that is in what time period? Have I gotten ahead of ourselves?
That's World War I. That's World War I.
Sort of, okay.
1917.
That's the story you have to tell. I mean, that is just, and when I tell other people, it just becomes incredible. There's a strike going on, one of the many strikes in Butte.
There's a strike in Butte, and there's no officially recognized union in Butte. The Anaconda Copper Company does not recognize a union as a bargaining agent on behalf of its workers. And one of the unions that's contesting in Montana is called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies. And Frank
yeah.
Little was a Wobbly. Now, the IWW is an explicitly anti-capitalist union. Does not believe in private ownership. It's a socialist union, which is bad enough in the American instance. But it is also anti-war. It's a pacifist union. And the United States in 1917 had entered the First World War. So here are the industrial workers of the world out agitating in Butte in the summer of 1917 and alienating a lot of Montanans because of their talk against the war and their, I mean, basically when the United States entered the war, mining copper became patriotic. And if you're going to call for a general strike, like the Wobblies were doing, that's treason. And Frank Little was an exceptionally obnoxious IWW organizer. So he's lynched. I mean, he's lynched.
The car, big
Right.
black car, maybe not black, drives up. They get out. They drag him out of his
They drag
hotel?
him out of his room. He rented a room in Butte, and they tied him to the back of the back bumper and dragged him through the street, scraped his kneecaps off, and then hung him from a trestle.
And to this day, according to the book, they're still talking about
They
who
still
did
talk about it, and you can still get a conversation going in Butte. Everybody in Butte knows who did it, but they won't tell.
I think we're going to quit right there because
All right.
it's out. And please come back and maybe we can finish the history of Montana in
All right.
another hour because this is just fascinating stuff.
Well, it's your beck and call.
Thank you
All right?
very much. I've really
Hey,
enjoyed it.
thank you, Greg.